You believe you could never do something truly evil. Not really. Not to another human being. That belief feels solid. It feels like bedrock. It is also, according to some of the most unsettling research in psychology, only half true. Think about the people history remembers as monsters: camp guards, executioners, soldiers who followed orders that ended in massacres. You picture them as different from you, twisted somehow from birth, broken in a way you are not. But when psychologists actually studied these people, something strange kept happening. They looked ordinary, employed, married, polite to their neighbors. Many had never hurt anyone before, and never would again once the situation changed. So the question stopped being, what kind of person does this? It became something harder to sit with. What if the wrong situation can turn almost anyone into someone else? In 1961, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram set out to test exactly that. He told volunteers they were helping with a memory experiment. Their job was simple: read word pairs to a man in another room, and every time he got one wrong, deliver an electric shock. Each wrong answer raised the voltage. The screaming man screamed. He begged to stop. Eventually, he went silent, which is somehow worse. Here's the part that unsettled an entire field of science. The shocks were fake. The screaming man was an actor. The real experiment was never about memory at all. It was about you and how far you'll go when someone in a lab coat calmly tells you to continue. Milgram predicted almost no one would go to the maximum voltage. He was wrong. Roughly 2 out of 3 participants delivered the highest shock on the panel, a level labeled in blunt red letters as dangerous. They were sweating. Some were shaking. Some laughed nervously, the way people laugh when something is deeply wrong. But most of them kept pressing the switch because a calm voice beside them said, "The experiment requires that you continue." Why would that sentence work on so many people? Milgram's answer was that most humans are wired to defer to authority, almost automatically, especially inside a system that feels legitimate. You don't need to believe the order is right, you just need to believe someone else is responsible for it. The moment responsibility shifts, so does behavior. The self doesn't vanish, it just steps quietly out of the driver's seat. Milgram didn't stop at one version of the experiment. He ran dozens of variations, changing one small detail at a time, and the results shifted every time. Move the victim into the same room as the participant, close enough to see his face, and obedience dropped sharply. Put the participant's hand on the switch alongside someone else's, sharing the action instead of doing it alone, and obedience rose again. Distance from consequences and distance from blame turned out to matter more than character did. The closer the harm felt, the harder it became to inflict. The more it could be split across other hands, the easier it became to allow. That single detail explains something that shows up far outside a psychology lab. Firing squads have sometimes issued one blank round among the live ones, so no soldier can be certain his was the fatal shot. Bureaucracies split decisions across departments, so no single signature ever feels like the one that caused the harm. You don't need a conspiracy for this to happen. You only need enough hands on the switch that no individual has to feel like the one who pulled it. 10 years later, a psychologist named Stanley ran a different experiment, one that has become almost as famous and almost as controversial. He turned a university basement into a mock prison, assigned ordinary students to play guards or prisoners, and planned to observe them for 2 weeks. He stopped after 6 days. The guards had escalated into real cruelty. The prisoners had started to break down for real. For decades, this was taught as proof that a role alone can corrupt a person. More recent analysis has complicated that story. Researchers who re-examined the original recordings found some guards were actively coached toward cruelty, rather than sliding into it naturally on their own. The takeaway isn't that Zimbardo's findings were meaningless, it's that even a landmark study on how power reshapes people needs to be checked against its own conditions, the same as any other claim. So if role and pressure aren't the whole answer, what is? Around the same era, a philosopher named Hannah Arendt sat in a Jerusalem courtroom watching the trial of a Nazi bureaucrat named Adolf Eichmann, a man who had helped organize the logistics of mass murder. She expected a monster. Instead, she found something almost boring. A man who spoke in cliches, who insisted he was simply following procedure, who seemed to genuinely believe he had done nothing worth losing sleep over. Arendt called it the banality of evil. Not a demon behind the axe, a kind of thoughtlessness, a failure or refusal to ever really imagine the human being on the other end of the paperwork. That idea connects to something else psychologists have since studied directly. Albert Bandura spent years researching what he called moral disengagement, the mental tricks people use to keep hurting others while still believing they're decent. Relabel the harm with softer language. Compare it to something worse so it looks minor by comparison. Spread the blame across a group so no single person feels the full weight of its guilt. Focus only on your one small task, and let the larger outcome become someone else's problem. None of these require you to believe you are cruel. That's exactly what makes them so effective. There's one more piece to this, and it might be the most quietly persuasive of all. In the 1960s, researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser ran a study that had nothing to do with violence on the surface. They asked homeowners to place a small, unobtrusive sign in their window supporting safe driving. Almost everyone agreed. Weeks later, a different researcher came back and asked a much bigger favor: permission to install a large, ugly billboard on the same lawn. Homeowners who had accepted the small sign were dramatically more likely to agree to the huge one. Friedman and Fraser called it the foot in the door effect. Once you've said yes to something small, saying yes to something larger stops feeling like a new decision. It feels like consistency with who you already agreed to be. Now, put that mechanism inside a system built on obedience or hierarchy or ideology. Nobody is handed the worst version of an act on day one. They're handed a smaller version first, one that barely registers as a compromise. Enforce a slightly unfair rule. Look away from a slightly cruel joke. Sign a slightly questionable form. Each yes makes the next yes easier and cheaper and more consistent with the version of yourself you've already accepted. By the time the request becomes something you would have refused outright at the start, refusing no longer feels like standing your ground. It feels like betraying who you've already become. Put these pieces together and a different picture forms. Extraordinary crimes rarely start with someone deciding to become extraordinary. They start with a small step that feels almost reasonable in the moment. A little more pressure. A little more distance from the consequences, a little more permission from an authority, a group, or a title. Each step alone looks survivable. It's only the sum of them that looks like something you would never have agreed to at the start. Does that mean everyone is secretly capable of atrocity, given the right nudge? Not equally and not automatically. Some people resist, even under enormous pressure, and their resistance matters. Milgram's own data showed roughly a third of participants refused to continue, even when pushed. Situational forces bend behavior. They don't erase the individual completely, but they bend it far more than most people are comfortable admitting about themselves. This isn't only a story about history's worst chapters. The same mechanics show up in far smaller, far more familiar moments. A worker who stays quiet about a defective product because it's not my department. An employee who follows a policy they privately find unfair because pushing back feels like more trouble than it's worth. A crowd online that pulls apart a stranger one comment at a time because no single reply feels like it could be enough to cause real damage on its own. None of these people would call themselves capable of harm. They rarely have to. The system does the heavy lifting, one small, deniable step at a time. Consider how many modern institutions are quietly built around this same distribution of responsibility. A large decision gets broken into dozens of smaller approvals spread across departments, so that if something goes wrong, no single person signed off on the whole thing. A harmful policy gets described in language so neutral it barely sounds like a choice at all, just a process, a procedure, a standard. None of this requires cruelty from the people inside it. It only requires that each person focus narrowly on their own small piece and trust that someone else is watching the larger picture. Often, nobody is. Even everyday cruelty online follows the same blueprint. A pile-on rarely starts with one person deciding to destroy a stranger's life. It starts with dozens of people adding one small comment each, certain that their single reply couldn't possibly be the one that tips someone over the edge. Diffusion of responsibility doesn't require malice from any individual involved. It only requires enough individuals, each convinced their own contribution is too small to count. Which is why the more useful question was never, am I a good person? It's, what small permissions am I giving myself right now, and who am I quietly letting take responsibility for them? The people in Milgram's lab weren't lying when they said they felt terrible. They kept going anyway. Feeling bad about something and refusing to do it turn out to be two very different muscles, and only one of them actually stops the switch from being pressed. That gap between feeling and action is the real subject of all this research. More than obedience, more than authority, more than any single experiment's headline result. Almost everyone predicts they would be the one to refuse. Almost everyone who has actually been tested discovers the prediction was more comforting than accurate. That isn't a reason for despair. People who understood in advance exactly which pressures tend to erode resistance were measurably better at resisting them when the moment came. Naming the mechanism in advance is itself a kind of defense, one the participants in these studies never had the chance to use. You still believe you could never do something truly evil. Now you know exactly why that belief is the most dangerous thing about you.